On stage, he looked untouchable. The spotlight burned bright, the music thundered through the arena, and thousands of eyes were fixed on a single figure standing with unmatched charisma. Every movement of his body triggered screams of excitement. Every note he sang felt like pure magic. To the world, he was a living legend at the peak of his power. But far from the cameras, far from the cheers and applause, there was a painful truth he never spoke about. His body was slowly beginning to fail at a time when his name dominated headlines, when his concert schedule was relentless and the demands of fame never allowed rest. Elvis began to sense that something was wrong. At first, it felt like ordinary exhaustion. His body felt heavy. His head often ached. Sleep no longer brought relief. These symptoms seemed minor, even normal, for someone carrying the weight of global fame. But day by day, exhaustion turned into pain. Pain that could not be explained. Pain that could not be shown. Pain that, in his world, was not allowed to exist. The entertainment industry of that era showed little mercy. A star was expected to be perfect at all times, no matter the cost. Being sick was not an excuse. Weakness was not an option. And Elvis, surrounded by pressure from all directions, chose silence. He learned how to smile while his body screamed. He learned how to stand tall while his legs trembled beneath him. He learned how to sing while his breathing grew heavy and his chest often felt tight. Every night before stepping onto the stage, he had to gather whatever strength remained. Alone in his dressing room, away from the noise and chaos, Elvis often sat in front of the mirror, staring at his own reflection, trying to convince himself that he could still do it. Just one more show. Just one more night. Just a little longer. He told himself that the pain could be endured, at least until the curtain fell. But the human body has limits. And Elvis's body began sending signals that were impossible to ignore. Sudden waves of pain, irregular heartbeats, extreme fatigue that made getting out of bed feel like a battle. There were nights when he woke up drenched in cold sweat, gasping for air, with a sense of fear he could not explain, yet to the world, he remained the image of strength, control, and perfection. Those closest to him noticed the changes. His movements on stage were no longer as fluid as before. His face often appeared pale. His eyes sometimes looked distant, as if he were carrying a heavy burden inside. But few dared to ask questions. Elvis was a legend, and legends, in the eyes of the world, were not meant to look fragile. In his quiet moments, Elvis began to confront one of the greatest fears a performer could face: the fear of losing control over his own body. For a singer, the body is not just a vessel. It is everything. Voice, breath, stamina, focus, each depended entirely on physical strength. And when the body began to betray him, panic slowly crept in. There were days when he wanted to stop. Days when he wanted to admit that he could not go on. But every time that thought surfaced, it was crushed by the image of thousands of fans, mounting contracts, and the crushing expectations of the world. That he felt trapped. Trapped between protecting his health and protecting the legend. The illness did not only attack his body, it invaded his mind. Constant pain drained him emotionally. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. Long nights were spent in isolation, accompanied by physical discomfort and thoughts that refused to rest. In silence, Elvis began to lose pieces of the man he once was. On stage, he was still the Elvis the world adored. Behind the curtain, he was simply a tired man, struggling to survive one more day. Each performance became a gamble between professionalism and self-preservation. And almost every time Elvis chose the stage, there were moments when his body truly gave in. Moments when he had to sit for long periods after a show because his legs would not stop shaking. Moments when he needed help just to walk. Moments when pain in his chest forced him to pause before continuing the next song. But these moments rarely reached the public. What they saw were grand performances, the iconic smile, and a voice still powerful enough to fill an arena. Elvis was raised in a culture that taught men to be strong, to endure silently, to see complaint as weakness. And as a symbol of masculinity and confidence in his era, that pressure doubled. That he did not want to be remembered as a sick legend, that he wanted to be remembered as a king who stood until the very end. But the illness continued to tighten its grip. His body no longer recovered as quickly as it once had. Fatigue lingered longer. Pain struck harder. Slowly, he began to realize that the price he was paying was enormous. Perhaps too enormous. And yet, There was one thing that kept him going: music. Music was the only place where he still felt free, even while his body suffered. When he sang, the pain seemed to fade, transformed into emotion, flowing through his voice. The audience may not have known it, but many of his most powerful performances were born from hidden suffering. There were songs he sang with his eyes closed, as if he were speaking directly to his pain. Notes that sounded deeper, heavier, as if carrying the weight of an unspoken life. Without realizing it, his suffering added a new layer to his voice, a layer of honesty that could never be manufactured. But time cannot be cheated. A body pushed beyond its limits will eventually collapse. And when that moment comes, no spotlight is bright enough to hide the truth. Elvis began to face days when getting out of bed felt impossible. Days when pain outweighed determination. Days when strength was no longer enough. He never publicly shared the full extent of what he endured. Not with the media, not with the world. What he offered instead was his best performance, every single time, even when it drained the last of his energy. The world received a legend, but Elvis, the man, slowly lost himself. In the quiet of the night, he may have wondered whether it was all worth it, whether fame, love from millions, and a place in history justified the loss of health and inner peace. But those questions rarely found answers. There was only tomorrow, another performance, another demand to keep standing. The story of Elvis is a painful reminder of the dark side of fame, of how the world often forgets that behind every legend is a human being with a fragile body, with real pain, with limits that cannot be crossed without consequence. When Elvis's body began to fail, the world still asked for more, and he, despite everything, tried to give it, until one day, his body could no longer carry the weight of the legend he had become. This is not just a story about illness. It is a story about sacrifice, about silence chosen to protect an image, about a man who gave everything to the world, even when the world never knew what it cost him. And perhaps that is the deepest tragedy of all, that his greatest suffering happened at the very moment he was most loved.